Anyone out there got any burning questions in terms of what's the market's looking like at the moment in terms of where the buy-to-let space is?
Which way can you see the 125% and then 145% ratios on the buy-to-let? Can you see them going up or down or getting more sensible? Or
I don't actually think we're going to see them move, if I'm being honest. The reason these interest coverage ratios have come into those areas where it's be at 125 or the 145 is just looking at the overall cost that it takes to manage a rented property, particularly when you include the any voids and maintenance, and then also the tax liability, which has obviously come in from the tax changes. So I don't think we're going to see it move, unfortunately.
So we spent 25 years saying to the regulator, it's all about the stress test dummy. And it was 125 at 5, and then we took it up to 5.5 because the regulator said rates will move. So then Osborne stood up and changed the tax world for landlords. And the regulator then fed back to us in their document last autumn, lenders, it's all about the stress test dummies, change your stress tests. And 145 is not actually the technical answer. The technical answer for a high rate taxpayer is 156, and for a high rate taxpayer is 163. But all the lenders will recognise, I'm sure Charles will support me on this, when you get someone in that tax zone, they're not one-dimensional, they're not two-dimensional, they're three-dimensional, so you can afford to take a view. So we've all landed at 145 or 140 or something round about that, and the jury's out. This will play out over the next 2 or 3 years, and if we start seeing some elements of misbehaviour or default, the regulator will come back to us and say, now let's run the maths again. So it's never going to go backwards, and the only person who gets 125 is a basic rate taxpayer or the tenants in common. Roger Morris will talk to you about tenants in common till you eventually say, Roger, I've got it. Or they're a professional landlord with carry forward losses, and you're allowed to treat them as a basic rate taxpayer because they're not going to pay tax in the next 5-10 years. So we are where we are, and I'd say hopefully we'll stay where we are because, frankly, it's enough of a challenge for us all without getting any further into it.
I don't think there's really much to add there, David, to be fair. But ultimately, I think with everything that has happened over the last sort of 18 months, there's change after change after change, and some things need to remain stagnant. And I think that's kind of where it is at the moment. And lenders have so much more else to deal with as well. No doubt it will be revisited in the future, but I totally agree with what David and Charles have said.
Anyone else got any questions? Yes, sir.
So this follows on from the landlord side of things. How do you see lending? Because in the LNG presentation earlier, you said lending for the coming year is going to be about 30 million. Was it 35? Yeah. Slightly down from the previous year. How do you see this going forward, especially with the changes and the tightening of buy-to-let lending somewhat? And also, on a second side, as far as landlords are concerned, there's been talk about rentals going up as a result of the changes in taxation. Do you really see that playing out? The house building has come up somewhat. Still, it's going to take time for us to catch up with demand. Where do you see that playing out also? In rents, one in rent and the other thing in lending.
Oh, thanks for the question. Shall I take the landlords? So I think increasingly landlords are finding it difficult to have those conversations with tenants about rental increases. All of our data consistently shows that there's a large segment of landlords who are running their portfolio actually at below market rent levels because they would much rather keep a good regularly paying non-troubling tenant in situ than go through the trouble of kind of marketing and churning portfolio properties every 12 or 18 months. We're about to size that in our next wave of research, actually, so it'll be interesting to see what proportion of landlords actually think that's the case for them. Again, we're measuring typical rental increases of between 3% and 4%, nothing like the kind of horror headlines that you might read in some of the media. That's at a UK level. There's clear regional variations on that. But equally, as the coming presentation will show, we're measuring a softening of demand. We're not saying that tenant demand is decreasing at all, but there's definitely evidence that that the market might be plateauing, and certain parts of the country actually are seeing a softening in tenant demand. All of these things combined just to make it harder for land. Obviously the default assumption is landlords will just increase rents. That's not going to be the case, I don't think. Yeah.
Is this on the size of the market? Yes, you're absolutely right. You know, this year, if you think back last year, it was about 40 billion, probably going to come down to 35. There's some debate whether next year it will be around about 30, a little bit higher than 30 or around about 30. I suspect it will be around about 30. Post 2018, I expect the decrease to start plateauing, but it will stop being so steep, but it will still probably continue to decrease. I guess there's a number of things at play. There's obviously will be a number of landlords who are potentially going to exit the market. So that will reduce the size of the market. I think landlords will have to put in more equity. I think that's the main thing of all of the lending changes over the last 12 months means that landlords will need to put in more equity, and therefore the size of the mortgages will reduce. So there's that impact. And then I think the other big thing, which we're probably yet to truly comprehend, is that if you go back 12 months ago, the majority of mortgages were 2-year fix, potentially 3-year fix. They've all moved to 5-year fix because there's a little affordability loophole. Suddenly, rather than churning that mortgage rather than renewing that mortgage every 2 years, it will be going into a 5-year cycle. So that may also reduce the market.
From our perspective, I think all these comments are actually really valid in terms of the market. And for us, in terms of next year, we see it to decrease a little bit in terms of the amount of lending. However, if you take actually what is out there in terms of the rented sector, is still, I know the tenants and what you were saying around there in terms of the demand, but it's quite interesting because if you look in sort of the demographics in the older, later life generation, there are some demographics there that actually can't get on the property ladder, say if they've had a divorce and their marital property hasn't been able to give the two of them a mortgage-free property, and sometimes they have a challenge with affordability onto getting a mortgage, so they are looking at the private rented sector. So I think there is some demand out there still. Whether that will remain the same or decrease is a question, obviously, but there are some demographic changes that are happening that still want that, and we have a transient workforce. The younger generation move around quite a lot, and sometimes their attitude to renting is slightly different to an older generation. And I think what we have to think about is that, as Charles says, some of the landlords might go out of the market. It'd be interesting to see who picks up those properties, whether it's actually more landlords that pick it up or in the professional space, or is it the first time buyers or those that have that affordability that pick them up. So it's still to play out, I think.
And I totally agree with Charles on the direction and quantum of the numbers. And 2019 could see a number that starts with a 2, but it'll be a high 2, so 27, 28 billion. Because the one thing that no data tracks, and that's whether it's residential or buy-to-let, is product transfers. And in the old days, landlords remortgaged because they remortgaged and capital raised and it moved on to new lender. That appears in the numbers. Many landlords will now stay with their existing lender and have a product transfer process. Aldermore run it, as do all lenders now, and those numbers will just drop straight out of the system. And we don't yet know what that number could be, but it could be anywhere between 2 to 5 to 6 billion by the time we get 2 or 3 years out. So beware of the headline numbers, beware of the stories that Solutions, Strategy, Introducer, other magazines write, and beware of the quotes that I give, because I'll always give a nice spicy quote to get the market going and to irritate Charles. But the reality is the numbers are always somewhat suspect. One has to look through them and think what's really going on here. And I particularly liked your comment about if we're all charging into 5-year rates, those are remos that won't be happening in 2019, they'll be happening in 2021 or 2022.
As a broker, I'm currently finding that many lenders out there are discrepancies with their criteria. So I'm finding, for example, the likes of Virgin and Paragon, they're capping their lending to only 3 properties in a portfolio. There are some lenders that have no caps, or they have caps on the loan sizes. Now, the question is, do you think some lenders are becoming over-conscious of where the market's heading for a disaster, in David's words, a car crash, or is it because they simply think they haven't got the appetite for that type of risk? So they're capping it at 3, or the likes of Kent Reliance, Aldermore, go beyond that, and they're not capping the amount of properties.
But Paragon have just rebranded. So they've got the old Mortgage Trust brand is now Paragon. They've got Paragon Portfolio, so your landlord who falls into the new world of 4 or more mortgage properties will still be dealt with by Paragon on the portfolio. Because, we all sitting up here will still refer to Paragon as the big beast. They were the landlord lender pre-credit crunch. They're back in that space. So they will still be doing portfolio landlords, trust me, plenty. But some lenders will make a virtue of not doing portfolio landlords. They will be best in class with service delivery, well-priced products for the amateur property investor with just 2 or 3 properties. And that's still a good market. Other lenders who've never done it will try and transition into the space and will experience service issues. I mean, Aldermore's in the fortunate position that they've always fished in both ponds, so this is business as usual for them. But there are some lenders who are going to step into this new world and they're going to find the experience really quite uncomfortable. So please, but Paragon, trust me, they're in that space.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting in terms of how late certain lenders came out with what they were going to do in this space, because it is the attitude to risk and the appetite for it, but it's also technology plays a large part in this as well. And if you've got sort of a mass player in the market, it's very hard to adapt that technology quite quickly. So you really have to evaluate whether it's a market that you want to go into. But I think as time goes on, this is kind of a test and try phase for a lot of lenders as well. And it may be that, you know, when they stick their head above the parapet, it's kind of testing the waters to see where they fit against their competitors, to see where they fit in the market with the customers that you have in front of them. And it's like any changes that make with the ICR rates that came in at the beginning of the year as well. Adaptations were made at the time when they were out for a couple of months, and some changes were made. So I think it's the same. It's kind of just seeing how it goes with some of the lenders. But you're right, as David says, some of them will just concentrate with the amateurs rather than going up into the professionals, and some that have been doing it for many years and will continue.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said. And you know, if Paragon did come out and say they were pulling out of the portfolio landlord, I would have a grin so big I couldn't even speak now. So they 100% are serving portfolio landlords, and they're absolutely fantastic at it, as I'm sure we all know. I guess it's not just a risk piece when a lender is considering this, though. It's about cost, income, and returns. And I know some lenders have pulled away from portfolio landlords, as Marie was saying, just because the amount of investment they will have to put in to design the systems and processes and have the right people and technology is just too much for the size of the market that they see it being. And also, you know, there's so much regulatory change going out there from a banking and a lending point of view. You've got GDPR, which is a really big thing on the horizon. Everyone's spending millions, if not billions, on. We've got IFRS 9, IRB. There's lots of things out there that banks are having to contend with when they're deciding where to invest money. And I know, you know, for example, you mentioned Virgin pulling out of it. Yes, Virgin have pulled out of portfolio landlords, but they have a fantastic new build proposition that they're sort of pushing at the moment. So it's about choosing which market you need to put into and where do you want to put the investment.
Yeah, just kind of one contextual observation, I guess. Looking at the stats, the average portfolio size in the UK is around three properties. About 75% of landlords have just one property. So in scale terms, you know, the vast majority of landlords, this isn't going to be an issue for them, at least, you know, in the short term. Further up, we estimate somewhere around 5% of landlords have 20 or more properties. 10% of landlords are north of 10 properties. You start to get a sense for, you know, the volume of individual landlords that are going to be affected by, you know, the PRA regs and so on. So in volume terms, I think it's interesting, and I'll talk about it in a little while. But around 6 in 10 landlords who've applied for a mortgage recently have reported it's much harder work than it has been historically, and that's research pre, you know, the new PRA regs. So from a customer effort perspective, even working through, you know, very helpful and effective brokers, landlords themselves are thinking, you know, this is getting to be harder work for me.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience, please?
I don't think it'd be a good seminar unless we had the EU in it. So the migrant workers coming from the EU previously have obviously bolstered the rental sector. They've begun to go home in their droves, apparently, if we believe the headlines. How do you see that affecting the rental sector and really address the landlord more than anything?
Just a quick kind of research perspective on that. Qualitatively, certainly landlords in this neck of the woods and in other kind of larger city-based areas are quite worried about it. You know, we've recently interviewed HMO owners all around the country for a particular lender, and those with exposure to to EU workers are quite concerned that before much longer they're going to be experiencing a lot of empty rooms potentially across those areas, and they're thinking about their strategies for kind of coping with that. The strategy won't be to sell the HMO, but it'll be how can I fill this? How can I price this? Alternatively to fill those rooms.
You're absolutely right. I think it is a risk, and it's certainly something that a lot of people that we're speaking to are concerned about. It will be interesting to see, like as with all of these things, there's so much inputs into a very complex system. It's very hard to understand what's going to happen. I was speaking to one economist not that long ago, and he was saying actually you may see a short-term increase in demand from the migrant, from the kind of the EU citizens. As previously you had EU citizens who would come over here, they would be settling down and looking to buy, but actually there's so much uncertainty that actually they are more willing to stay and say, actually I'm going to continue renting for a couple of years where previously I possibly would have bought. So it'll be interesting just to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, from that point of view, there's always that risk whenever, isn't there, in everything that happens with changes, and obviously the Brexit is one that overhangs us, has been for a while. What I tend to find talking with different brokers and talking to their customers is that actually it's kind of like, are we getting out of this market or are we staying in this market as a landlord? But actually a lot of the discussion is about how do I evolve what I'm doing and where do I put that investment in and what type of properties do I have? And it's kind of interesting to see that from the brokers that I've been speaking with and sort of their customers, is kind of seeing how that plays out first before we make any big decisions. But it's always thinking in the back going, okay, if that is the case and they do go, where do I get them from? And it's that involvement of what I do with that portfolio.
The only thing I know from history that the faster set of heels in the room is a broker, and we've had to adapt and change, but the next set of heels that's faster are landlords. They will adapt and flex to what comes along, but we don't yet know how this is all going to land. You know, some people say this may not play out at all. So I think landlords may have to accept some change of their perception of rent, but they will continue to rent. My goodness, they will grumble, and they know how to grumble even more than brokers, but they are pretty fleet of foot and they're pretty imaginative, and like the rest of us, they'll get over it.
I agree with all that. Just to put aside, in our latest research, we talked to 1,000 landlords. 15% said they rent at least one property to a migrant worker currently. So just to put some scale on that.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience, please? Anyone got anything they'd like to ask? I have actually got some questions here that have been submitted to me prior to the event taking place, but it says on here, buy-to-let has taken a bit of a battering recently. Do you think that is it for now and that's the end of the regulatory changes? Who would like to go first?
Well, most of these changes are only just landing. That's the issue. They take time to land, and landlords will feel the tax hit on about 23rd of January 2019 and then 2021 and 22, and they will be very, very grumpy by the time they get to New Year in 2022. The stamp duty is there. They're not going to repeal it. I hear people saying they've got to repeal it. They don't have to do anything, actually. It's an income line on the business plan of HMRC now. So if the minister says, I want to repeal it, they'll say, well, who else are you going to soak for it? And landlords are the magic money tree at the bottom of the HMRC garden at the moment. So there's nothing more coming down the pipe that we know of. Will anything more come from Europe? I guess not. The regulator has made it quite clear if we don't pay attention, and I say we, that's both lenders, brokers and landlords, if we don't pay attention they could do more, because they've given extra powers to the PRA to pull levers if they want to. But we've got our feet off the ground at the moment. We don't know what is changing behaviours of landlords. Is it stamp duty? Is it the tax changes? Is it other regulatory changes on HMOs? And things will change, but we won't be able to decide what changes the behaviour because too many levers have been pulled. So I guess we've got to try and let this play out. So if the regulator was listening, I'd say, please, just let this play through for 2 to 3 years. You've got the volumes down, that's what you wanted. We're all behaving nicely, we're all doing extra tax returns, we're doing what you want. Let's run this out for at least 3 years.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, I think it is going to be a period of stability. They're going to sort of let's see how the market plays out. You know, I guess the one unknown in the room, that is if Theresa falls up with Arlene from the DUP and the government collapses and Jeremy gets in and puts in rent controls. You know, that's a whole new ball game to sort of deal with. So I think near term, medium term is going to be fine. In the long term, from a lender's point of view, I guess the big thing on the horizon is about 5 years away. There's a new Basel set of rules coming out in terms of the amount of capital that lenders have to hold against their loans, and they are looking specifically at the buy-to-let loans as well. So that may end up pushing the amount of capital that lenders hold for buy-to-let possibly 3 times what we are now, so threefold. If that pushes the capital up threefold, therefore the returns that the banks are making reduce threefold, and therefore there may be some change in pricing. But you know, I think that is sort of 5 years away, at least.
I guess the only thing that I would kind of add to that is kind of echoing those sentiments, particularly David, in the fact that, you know, just let it settle and see how it goes. We've never known a chancellor in the past give away an income stream. So the fact that we're sitting here hoping that certain things will change, it's not likely going to happen. There's an income stream that's there, it's set. You've never known a chancellor change that. I think it's seen now to see what it means and what it means for the market and what it means going forward. And I think it's that time just to see the changes settle in and see what happens going forward. And you would like to think they would take that pragmatic approach and that common sense approach that we have been talking about these changes for nigh on 2-3 years, knowing they were coming down the line. We've got through that journey. Let's just deal with it and have a bit of breathing space to see. And I think hopefully taking that pragmatic approach, that will happen.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, from a landlord's perspective, they don't know what to expect, I think, at the moment. All of the stuff, budget 2015, autumn statement 2015, and subsequently has hit them, you know, pretty left field. You know, and they've had to adapt, you know, really rather rapidly to that stuff. So, you know, I think they're approaching this autumn statement with a sense of trepidation in terms of, you know, what's next for us. Anecdotally, qualitatively, we've heard some concern from limited company landlords recently that they might be next, you know, potentially identified as a bit of a loophole and might be subject to, you know, some kind of intervention down the line. But from a landlord's perspective, it's who knows and who knows when, really.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Anyone got any questions from the audience? I think I've got one question, I think, which is probably pretty much on everybody else's lips at the moment, and I think I'm going to ask it. Do you think interest rates will rise before the end of the year? I've been asked that many, many, many times over the last few weeks. So one final comment from all the panel members.
Yeah, quickly, again, with my landlord's head on. They're expecting base rate increases, and they're thinking about kind of the resilience of their business model. Our work shows that for most landlords, it would take something very, very significant to tip them into any kind of financial trauma. There's enough kind of resilience in the business model for the vast majority of landlords to be able to cope with anything until we start talking about kind of 3.5% type of increases.
So on 23rd of September, Moody's, the rating agency, trashed UK government debt, and swap rates, 5-year swap rate, went from about 0.75% to 1.1%, and it's not come down. So if you think that Charles and I will be holding our 5-year fixed rate products where they currently are come January 1, I think you'll be hoping for the magic money tree solution, and I think he'll move on the November inflation report, and he'll start the escalator, and we'll go up by 0.25%.
Yeah, we kind of agree in that sense that it will go up slightly in that report. And surprisingly, if you think about it, why it hasn't gone up already in that relation. If you think about Brexit and what's happening, there's actually nowhere to go if Brexit doesn't go as we would hope. If you'd have gone up 0.25%, you maybe could have brought it back down. But the economic indicators for inflation are around 3% now. We're showing economic improvement. So yeah, it wouldn't be surprising if it goes up in there and about 0.25% as well.
Yes, I think that's right. You know, the Bank of England and Mark Carney are actually in quite a difficult position, because when you look at the economic indicators, you probably want to keep interest rates as low as possible. But, you know, the AMO of the Bank of England and the MPC is to manage inflation, and inflation is running away. So I think, you know, it is, you're absolutely right. In November, it would be a shock if rates don't go up by 0.25% in November. That being said, the interesting thing from a lender point of view, not so much admittedly specialist lenders, but I guess the more high street lenders, is a lender takes all the funding and then swaps it and swaps it into LIBOR curves, typically 3-month LIBOR. And if you look, whenever Carney, what was it, 4 or 5 weeks ago as well, made indications that he was going to increase in November, that was already baked fully into the swap curves. So when you look at that, the funding costs for banks have already gone up. Okay, bank base rate hasn't gone up, but the swap curves have gone up, and that's the most important thing. And therefore, you can see in the high street, particularly in the residential market, that actually rates have started to increase over the last few weeks, and we've seen a number of the high street players sort of increase rates. I guess the thing that's stopping that happening in the buy-to-let at the moment is probably there's so much headwind, so much unknowns, that people are, you know, given the changes that have just come around from the PRA phase 2, lenders are probably unwilling to increase rates at the moment because there's just so much going on. But I imagine rates will inevitably go up at some point, absolutely.
Can I just add one thing to that, is that if the rate does go up, a third of customers now are still on SVR. So if anything, it will actually prompt the remortgage market to actually get customers to think about, actually, I'm paying quite a lot here. Let's have a re-look at and obviously an opportunity for brokers to actually do that business for them. So overall, what happens, it's an opportunity.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our panel today. Charles, Marie, David and Mark. Thank you very much for the questions. I hope they've got the answers out there for you. From all of us, thank you very much for now. Speak to you all very soon. Thank you.